The inspection bay sat beneath the eastern wing, a concrete space that never fully warmed even in summer. The Royal Guard stood just inside the threshold, boots aligned with the yellow line painted decades earlier. The vehicle remained where it had been left, an unremarkable transport unit used for short palace transfers. Its exterior showed no sign of tampering. That was the problem. He held the tablet at chest height, eyes moving between the screen and the vehicle. The checklist showed a completed sweep, signature present, time logged, clearance granted, all of it clean, too clean. He lowered the tablet and crouched, running his gloved fingers along the underside of the rear axle. Dust came away unevenly. Someone had been there recently. The official report claimed otherwise. The bay was silent except for the faint hum of ventilation. Overhead lights cast a pale, clinical glow that flattened every surface. He listened, not for sound, but for interruption. None came. He moved methodically as he had been trained. Panels, compartments, seals. Each step followed protocol, though this inspection technically no longer existed. The clearance had already been granted. Any further search was redundant, unofficial. He was aware of that. He continued anyway. The rear storage compartment opened with a controlled release of air. Inside, the space was empty except for a folded maintenance top. He lifted it. Beneath, a thin strip of adhesive residue clung to the metal floor, fresh, not noted in the log. He straightened slowly. The tablet vibrated once in his hand, a routine status update request. He ignored it. The signature on the inspection report belonged to a junior officer assigned to perimeter duty that morning. The timestamp placed the clearance 12 minutes before the vehicle had arrived in the bay. Impossible, unless the inspection had occurred elsewhere, or not at all. He closed the compartment and stepped back, scanning the bay. No cameras inside, by design. Inspections were meant to be witnessed, not recorded. Trust was the system. It still was, officially. He returned to the tablet and pulled the raw data. The metadata confirmed it. The report had been uploaded from a terminal 2 levels above, not from the bay console. Someone had signed off remotely. He felt the shift then. Not fear, not urgency, but weight, the kind that settled when a situation crossed from procedural anomaly into intent. The guard exited the bay and sealed the door behind him. In the corridor, the air was warmer, the light softer. Palace sounds returned, distant footsteps, the muted echo of voices carried through stone, life continuing as expected. He walked to the records alcove adjacent to the bay. It was a narrow space, rarely used, holding physical backups of transport logs. Most guards never touched them. Digital records were considered sufficient. He slid open the cabinet and removed the folder corresponding to the day's transfers. The pages were crisp, too crisp. He flipped through them, scanning for inconsistencies. One page caught his attention, a duplicate inspection form, unsigned, timestamp blank. It had been filed behind the completed report, as if meant to be overlooked. He removed it carefully. The form listed a secondary sweep, unchecked boxes, a handwritten note at the bottom, faint but legible. Rear compartment requires follow-up. No follow-up had occurred. He folded the page once and slipped it into the inner pocket of his uniform. The fabric settled flat, concealing the outline. He closed the cabinet and returned the folder. When he stepped back into the corridor, he paused. The palace felt unchanged, order intact, but something had been removed from the system, and something else had been put in its place. He resumed his patrol, posture unchanged, pace steady. The tablet vibrated again. This time he acknowledged it. "Inspection complete," the message read. He looked down the corridor toward the transport wing where the vehicle would soon be reassigned. "Yes," he typed. Then, after a moment, he added nothing more. He did not return to his standard route. Instead, the guard adjusted his path by a single junction, passing through a service corridor that ran parallel to the administrative offices. The change was minor, defensible if questioned. He had learned long ago that most deviations were ignored if they appeared unremarkable. The corridor smelled faintly of polish and old stone. Lighting here was dimmer, fixtures spaced farther apart. He slowed as he approached the auxiliary records room, a space used primarily during audits, its access rarely logged unless formally requested. The door opened with his credentials. Inside, the room was cool and quiet, shelves lined with archived tablets and sealed envelopes. He moved to the terminal and logged in under his clearance. Transport records were restricted, but not to him. Not yet. He searched for the junior officer whose signature appeared on the inspection. The personnel file opened without delay. No disciplinary notes, average performance evaluations, recently transferred from ceremonial duty, no history of transport clearance authority. That alone was irregular. He pulled the officer's duty log for the morning. The timeline showed perimeter assignment from 0600 to 1000, no recorded movement to the transport wing, no authorization to conduct inspections. The guard saved the file locally, then paused. Saving created a trace. He considered the risk, then proceeded anyway. Some traces were worth leaving. Next, he accessed the vehicle's assignment history. The transport unit had been used 3 times that week, all short internal transfers, nothing unusual on the surface. He scrolled further back. 2 weeks prior, the same vehicle had been flagged for a delayed inspection. The note was brief, resolved, no details. He cross-referenced the resolution. The same signature appeared. The guard leaned back slightly, eyes fixed on the screen. The pattern was emerging, though incomplete. Someone was using procedural familiarity to create gaps small enough to pass unnoticed. He logged out and wiped the terminal cache, leaving only what the system required. The unsigned inspection form remained in his pocket, warm now from his body heat. When he exited the records room, a voice stopped him. "Guard." He turned. A senior logistics officer stood at the corridor intersection, tablet in hand. Neutral expression, observant eyes. "Routine audit?" the officer asked. "Yes," the guard replied. His tone matched the setting, flat, professional. The officer nodded once. "Transport schedules are tight today. We rely on efficiency." "So do we," the guard said. A pause followed, not hostile, evaluative. Vehicle inspections were cleared early, no issues reported. The guard met his gaze. None officially. The officer's eyes flicked briefly to the guard's uniform, then back to his face. "Good," he said. "Let's keep it that way." He walked on. The guard remained still until the sound of footsteps faded. Only then did he continue down the corridor, returning to his assigned route. As he walked, he replayed the exchange. It had not been a warning, not yet. It had been a measurement. Later, at his post overlooking the inner courtyard, he stood watch as the day progressed. Sunlight shifted across stone. Staff moved in predictable patterns. Somewhere above, a child's laughter echoed briefly, then disappeared behind closed doors. The guard did not react outwardly. He adjusted his stance, scanning as required. But his attention had narrowed. The unsigned form pressed lightly against his ribs, a reminder that something had been deliberately left unfinished. He knew now that the omission was not an error, it was a choice. And choices, once identified, could be followed. The route change appeared first as a footnote. The Royal Guard noticed it during the mid-morning schedule verification, a task so routine it often faded into muscle memory. He stood in the operations annex, one wall of glass overlooking the lower courtyard, the other lined with terminals. The room carried the faint static smell of electronics and recycled air. Screens glowed softly, displaying transport allocations, escort assignments, timing windows. He scanned without urgency. That was when the deviation surfaced. The young royal's afternoon movement from the private education wing to the residential annex had been adjusted. The original route, approved weeks earlier, used an interior passage secured exclusively by palace guard detail. The revised route diverted through the service drive, requiring vehicle transport for a distance that had never previously justified it. The justification field was brief: logistical efficiency. He did not react, he simply compared timestamps. The amendment had been made 40 minutes earlier. The authorization came from administrative scheduling, not security. That was unusual, but not prohibited. Palace operations allowed for flexibility, especially when senior officers requested it. He opened the version history. The original route plan had been overwritten, not archived. That required intent. He checked the transport unit assigned. It was the same vehicle. He closed the screen and looked out through the glass. Below, the courtyard remained orderly. 2 junior guards crossed from west to east, steps synchronized. A gardener trimmed hedges along the perimeter wall. Nothing in the physical space reflected what had shifted digitally. The guard returned his attention to the terminal and pulled up escort assignments. His name was not attached to the revised movement. Neither were any guards from his rotation. The escort detail had been reduced by 1 position, replaced with a palace compliance officer listed as observer. Observer was not a security designation. He accessed the compliance office directory. The assigned officer had disciplinary authority over internal conduct and youth protocol. Their presence on a transport escort was not standard, but it fell within discretionary overlap. The guard exhaled slowly through his nose. No outward sign, just controlled breath. He flagged the route change internally, not as a challenge, but as a request for clarification. The system accepted the query and assigned it a low-priority response window. That window would expire after the transport was complete. He left the annex and resumed patrol. Stone corridors absorbed sound, footsteps echoing briefly before dissolving into quiet. The palace was warm now, heat rising through centuries-old masonry. Sunlight filtered through narrow windows, catching dust in the air. As he passed the education wing, he slowed imperceptibly. Doors remained closed. Inside, instruction continued. Normality held. He paused at the junction where the original route would have passed. The corridor was narrow, heavily monitored, designed to minimize exposure. The revised route bypassed it entirely. He considered protocol. Route changes required security sign-off only when risk levels altered. On paper, this did not qualify. On paper, nothing had changed. He reached the stairwell and descended to the service level where transport coordination took place. The atmosphere shifted there, less ceremonial, more utilitarian. The air smelt faintly of fuel and cleaning solvent. A transport supervisor stood near the dispatch board, reviewing assignments. The guard approached, posture neutral. Afternoon movement for the minor principal, route adjustment noted. The supervisor glanced up. Yes, came down from admin. Security input. Not requested. A shrug, practiced. Vehicles cleared. The guard nodded.
Which vehicle? The supervisor hesitated a fraction of a second before answering. Unit 7. The same one. The guard thanked him and stepped away. The confirmation settled heavily, not as shock, but as accumulation. Separate irregularities were converging. He moved toward the service drive access point and stopped at the observation window overlooking the loading area. The transport unit sat idle, doors closed, no visible markings, no visible threats. He checked the time, 45 minutes until movement. He opened his internal channel and requested a temporary reassignment to perimeter observation near the service drive. The request was modest. It cited coverage optimization. Approval came quickly. He repositioned without drawing attention. From his new post, he could see the service drive entrance and part of the corridor where the child would emerge under escort. The space was quiet. Shadows pooled along the stone walls. The temperature dropped slightly in the shade. He waited.
The escort arrived early. The compliance officer appeared first, walking with measured confidence, tablet held against their side, their expression neutral, composed. They were dressed in administrative grey, indistinct by design. 2 guards followed, neither from the child protection rotation. Both appeared alert but deferential, posture subtly angled toward the compliance officer rather than the route ahead. The child came last, small for the space, dressed formally, hands clasped in front as instructed. There was no visible distress, no outward resistance, only a slight hesitation at the threshold where stone met open air. The guard observed from his position, still unremarkable. His face revealed nothing. As the group approached the vehicle, the compliance officer spoke quietly. The words did not carry. The child nodded once. The rear door opened. The guard's attention narrowed to specifics, distance, hand placement, timing. The compliance officer placed a hand on the child's upper arm, not roughly, but firmly enough to direct. The child flinched, almost imperceptibly, then corrected posture. The guard registered it. It was not abuse, not overtly. It was control applied without necessity. He watched as the child was guided into the vehicle. The door closed. The escort took positions. The transport supervisor signaled readiness. The vehicle remained stationary, awaiting final clearance. The guard keyed his internal channel. "Confirm inspection timestamp for Unit 7, he said calmly. A pause. Then, inspection cleared earlier today. Location. Bay inspection, signed off. The guard did not respond immediately. He watched as the compliance officer leaned toward the vehicle window, speaking briefly to the child inside. The glass obscured faces, but body language suggested instruction, not reassurance. "Copy," the guard said finally. The vehicle began to move. As it passed his position, he noted the compliance officer's hand resting on the doorframe, fingers tight, not protective, possessive. The transport disappeared down the drive, merging into the internal route. The guard remained at his post long after it vanished from view. When his shift rotation cycled, he returned to the operations annex and accessed the route logs. The system recorded the movement as completed without incident, no flags, no anomalies. He added none. Instead, he opened a private note file, unofficial, unindexed. He recorded times, names, observations. Language remained factual, no interpretation, no accusation. He saved it under a neutral designation and closed the file. Later, as evening settled and the palace quieted, he passed the residential annex. Lights glowed behind tall windows, curtains drawn. The child would be inside now, protected on paper.
The guard adjusted his route to pass beneath the window line, eyes scanning reflections rather than interiors. Somewhere above, movement flickered briefly, then stopped. He did not look up. The route change had been executed. The system had accepted it. No alarms had sounded. But the pattern was no longer abstract. The same vehicle, the same authority, the same quiet erosion of safeguards. The guard returned to his post and stood watch as night took hold, knowing that the next irregularity would not announce itself as clearly, and that when it came, there would be less room to simply observe. The document was thin enough to be missed, and that was why it had survived. The Royal Guard waited until the night rotation settled into its predictable rhythm before retrieving it. His post overlooked a secondary corridor rarely used after dusk, the stone walls absorbing sound, the lighting reduced to a low amber intended to discourage movement rather than illuminate it. He stood watch as assigned, posture unchanged, eyes forward. When the hour changed, he was relieved without comment. He did not go to the records office immediately. Instead, he took the long route through the maintenance passage that ran beneath the administrative wing. The temperature dropped there, the air cooler and faintly metallic. Pipes lined the ceiling, each labeled and dated, the system layered and old. He stopped at a junction where the noise from above faded almost completely. Only then did he remove the folded inspection form from his inner pocket. He smoothed it carefully against the wall, flattening the crease. The paper was standard issue, watermark intact. He scanned it again, slower this time. The unchecked boxes meant little by themselves. It was the notation that mattered. Rear compartment requires follow-up. No reference number, no escalation code, no initials. He returned the form to his pocket and continued on, emerging near the archival annex. Access was restricted at night, but his credentials allowed entry for security verification. He logged in without hesitation. The system recorded his presence. He accepted that. Inside, the annex was silent. Rows of terminals sat dark, except for one low-lit station designated for internal reviews. He activated it and navigated to the restricted archive, files removed from standard circulation but not formally sealed. He searched by vehicle ID. Several entries appeared. Most were routine, maintenance, fuel checks, scheduled cleanings. Then one line caught his attention. Behavioral transport notation, supplemental. The file was marked incomplete. He opened it. The screen filled slowly, as if reluctant. The report referenced a prior incident involving the same transport unit months earlier. The language was clinical, stripped of emotion. It described a minor principal exhibiting reluctance during transfer, requiring additional guidance. No injury was noted, no formal complaint recorded. The escalation field was blank. He scrolled. Attached was a secondary document, flagged but never filed. He opened it. This one was handwritten, scanned into the system but never assigned a case number. The writing was careful, professional, but tighter than usual. It detailed an escort observing excessive physical correction inconsistent with transport protocol. The escort's name had been redacted. The authority involved had not. It was the same compliance officer. The guard leaned back slightly, eyes fixed on the screen. The room felt colder now, though the temperature had not changed. The ventilation system hummed softly, indifferent. He checked the file metadata. The document had been uploaded, then immediately restricted. No follow-up actions logged, no disciplinary review initiated. The guard closed the file and reopened it, confirming what he already knew. This was not an oversight. This was containment. He accessed the access logs. Only 3 individuals had viewed the document since its upload. All were senior administrative staff. None had added commentary. He sat still for several seconds, hands resting flat on the desk. His breathing remained even. This was not anger, it was confirmation. He copied the metadata, not the document itself, into a secure note. Dates, access times, authorization codes, enough to establish existence without duplicating content. Duplicating would be noticed. He logged out and powered down the terminal. The screen went dark, reflecting his uniform faintly. He stood and left the annex, locking the door behind him. As he walked back toward his assigned sector, he replayed the phrasing in his mind. Additional guidance, physical correction, language designed to obscure without lying. By the time he reached the stairwell, he understood the structure. Reports were allowed to exist only if they remained unfinished. Incomplete files did not demand response. They lingered in the system like static. He paused at the top of the stairs, listening. Footsteps echoed somewhere below, distant and unconcerned. He resumed movement. At his post, he resumed watch. The palace at night was quieter, but not still. Systems cycled, guards rotated, authority slept behind secured doors. The child would be asleep now, somewhere above, under supervision that appeared appropriate on paper. The guard did not look up. He adjusted his stance and waited for the next hour to pass.
The pressure arrived without urgency. It came the following morning in the form of a message marked "Routine Clarification." The guard received it while standing in the East Gallery, sunlight spilling across the polished floor. Visitors would arrive later. For now, the space belonged to security and silence. The message requested confirmation of his access to the archival annex the previous night. No accusation, no reprimand, just a request. He acknowledged receipt and provided a standard response, security verification. Within minutes, a second message followed. Please report to Administrative Review, Room 3B. He did not alter his pace. Room 3B sat above the transport coordination level, accessible by a narrow stairwell rarely used by guards. The room itself was small, furnished with a table, 3 chairs, and a single terminal. The windows were frosted, light diffused but sufficient. 2 individuals waited inside. One was the logistics officer he had encountered earlier. The other was unfamiliar, older, posture relaxed, eyes sharp, oversight likely. "Thank you for coming," the older man said. "This won't take long." The guard stood until instructed to sit. He complied. "We noticed unusual access patterns, not improper, just unexpected." The guard remained silent. "You reviewed restricted transport files," the logistics officer added. "Was there a concern?" The guard chose his words carefully. "I was verifying completeness." "Completeness," the older man repeated. "Yes." A pause followed. The logistics officer glanced at the oversight representative, then back at the guard. "Those files are restricted for a reason. Incomplete records can be misleading." The guard met his gaze. "Incomplete records are incomplete." Silence settled briefly. Not hostile, assessing. "We trust our internal processes," the older man said. "Escalations occur when necessary." The guard nodded once. Understood. The meeting ended without resolution. No directive was given, no warning issued. But the tone had shifted. Observation had become interest.
When the guard left the room, he felt it immediately. Not tension, but narrowing, fewer paths forward, fewer neutral spaces. He returned to duty and completed his shift without incident, but as the day progressed, he noticed subtle changes. Access requests took longer to approve, queries returned less information, systems responded, but selectively. By evening, his internal note file triggered an automated review flag. Minor, easily dismissed, still it existed now. He stood watch as the child passed through a nearby corridor under escort. Different guards this time, no compliance officer present. The movement was brief, efficient. The guard observed without intervening. Later, alone again, he reviewed what he knew. A pattern of suppressed reports, a recurring authority, a child positioned repeatedly within that authority's reach. He had not yet crossed protocol, not fully, but he was approaching its edge. He closed his eyes for a moment, not in fatigue, but in calculation. The documents existed, that mattered. Truth had weight, even when buried. The guard opened his eyes and resumed scanning the corridor, knowing that the next step would not be about discovery. It would be about decision.
The pattern did not announce itself all at once. It revealed itself through alignment. The Royal Guard began with what could still be justified as routine correlation. He worked during authorized hours from authorized terminals, using access that had not yet been revoked. The palace systems were designed for efficiency, not suspicion. They assumed good faith until proven otherwise. He compared transport logs against disciplinary schedules. The overlaps were subtle. Not every movement coincided. Not every intervention involved the same authority, but enough did. Enough to suggest design rather than coincidence. He stood in the records corridor, light from the narrow windows slanting across the floor. Dust drifted slowly in the air. The tablet in his hands displayed a timeline, dates, times, annotations stripped to their barest form. Each time the child's routine was altered, the same administrative signature appeared somewhere upstream, sometimes direct, sometimes through delegation, always present. The compliance officer did not appear in every file. That would have been obvious. Instead, their name surfaced just enough to establish legitimacy. Other times, authority was exercised through proxy, junior staff acting under guidance, documents routed through neutral offices. The guard noted it all without expression. He cross-referenced personnel evaluations. The compliance officer's file was immaculate. No complaints, no disciplinary actions, commendations for maintaining order, for discretion, for effective behavioral correction. Language again. He moved on to suppressed reports, incomplete files, unassigned notes, observations that never matured into incidents. Each referenced a minor principle, not always the same one, but similar profiles, young, isolated, lacking direct advocates within the system. The guard's jaw tightened briefly, only briefly. This was not cruelty, not in the crude sense. It was governance through pressure, exercised where resistance was weakest and oversight least likely. He saved nothing. He recorded nothing new. He committed the pattern to memory. At midday, he was reassigned. The notice came without explanation. Effective immediately, his patrol area shifted from internal transit corridors to ceremonial perimeter oversight. A visible position, a contained one. He acknowledged the reassignment and moved accordingly. The perimeter was brighter, more open. Sunlight reflected off stone and polished metal. Tour groups would arrive soon. Visibility was high,
Risk, officially, was low. From this position, he could no longer access internal systems directly. That was the point. He stood at attention as visitors passed through controlled entry points, faces curious, unaware. The palace presented itself as intended, orderly, dignified, unassailable. During a scheduled rotation, he caught sight of the compliance officer crossing the inner courtyard. Their pace was unhurried. They did not look toward the perimeter. The guard watched until they disappeared through an administrative door. Later, during a brief respite, he reviewed what remained accessible: public-facing schedules, general movement notices, sanitized summaries. Even there, the pattern persisted. The child's name appeared less frequently now, movements shortened, windows tightened. On paper, it looked like increased protection. In practice, it meant fewer witnesses. As evening approached, the guard was summoned again, this time not to review, to listen.
The meeting was informal by design. It took place in a side chamber adjacent to the ceremonial hall, a space usually reserved for briefings before state events. The room was large enough to feel neutral, empty enough to discourage confrontation. 3 individuals were present: the logistics officer, the oversight representative, and a third, senior, unintroduced, dressed in the subdued attire of internal authority. "Your service record is strong, consistent, reliable." The guard stood straight, hands behind him. "You've demonstrated initiative that can be valuable or disruptive." A pause. "We are aware you've been reviewing historical files, looking for connections." The guard did not deny it. "There's a difference," the senior figure said, "between vigilance and fixation." The guard met his gaze. "I am tasked with protection." "Yes, within defined boundaries." The silence that followed was not hostile. It was instructional. "Children within the palace are subject to specialized governance. Correction is not abuse. Guidance is not harm." The guard remained still. "Patterns," the man continued, "can be constructed from incomplete data. You risk misinterpretation." The guard spoke then, carefully. "Incomplete data does not negate repetition." The logistics officer shifted slightly. The oversight representative watched without comment. "You are approaching a line, not of protocol, but of trust." The words settled heavily. Trust was currency here. Once depleted, it did not regenerate. "We are not issuing a reprimand. Consider this a recalibration." The meeting ended. No orders were given. None were needed. The guard returned to the perimeter as night fell. The air cooled. The palace lights shifted to evening configuration, windows glowing softly against the dark. From his position, he could see the upper levels of the residential wing, curtains drawn, lights dimmed, stillness. He knew now that the pattern was recognized, by him and by others. The difference was intention. He had been allowed to see as much as he had because it did not yet threaten outcome. Now it might. He adjusted his stance and continued his watch. The child would move again. That was inevitable. Schedules could be compressed, rerouted, justified. Authority would continue to operate within its interpretation of necessity. And the guard would be expected to observe, not interfere. As the hours passed, he considered his options, not emotionally, but structurally. Which channels remained? Which records could not be erased once created? Which actions, once taken, could not be quietly undone? He did not decide yet.
But the pattern had emerged fully now, clear enough to name. And naming something, even silently, changed how long it could remain hidden.
The order came through a restricted channel just after dawn. The Royal Guard received it while standing at the perimeter checkpoint, the sky still pale, the air cool enough to sharpen focus. The message was brief, precise, and deliberately impersonal. Return all unofficial materials. Stand down from further internal review. No signature appeared, but the authorization code traced upward, past logistics, past oversight, into executive security coordination, the kind of order that did not invite interpretation. He acknowledged receipt without delay. For the next hour nothing changed. Visitors arrived. Credentials were checked. Movements proceeded as scheduled. The palace functioned as it always had, seamless in its outward presentation. Internally, the guard measured time differently now. He knew exactly what the order referred to: the unsigned inspection form, the metadata notes, the internal correlations he had not formally recorded, but had nonetheless assembled. None of it existed in an official case file. That was intentional. It was also now a liability. He was instructed to return the materials to records control by midday. He did not move toward records control. Instead, when his rotation ended, he returned to the quiet storage locker assigned to him beneath the ceremonial wing. The space was narrow, concrete walls marked by decades of use. He removed his cap, set it carefully on the shelf, then reached into the inner pocket of his uniform. The folded form emerged unchanged. He placed it on the bench and looked at it without touching it for several seconds. Paper was fragile, authority was not. But paper endured in ways authority often did not, provided it was placed correctly. He folded the form again, smaller this time, and slid it into a sealed evidence sleeve, unmarked, unregistered. Then he placed it inside a maintenance manual that belonged in the archive, but was rarely accessed. The manual went back onto the shelf among others like it. If discovered, it would appear accidental. If not, it would remain. He replaced his cap and exited the locker room. The next step required care. He reported to records control as ordered, empty-handed. The clerk on duty logged his arrival, eyes flicking briefly to his uniform, then to the screen. "You were instructed to return materials," she said. "I reviewed records," the guard replied evenly. "No physical materials were removed." She nodded, typing. "Digital copies?" "None retained." The system accepted the response. By the time he returned to duty, the pressure had shifted. It was no longer about access, it was about compliance. Mid-afternoon, he was reassigned again, this time temporarily attached to transport oversight for the following day. The notice framed it as operational need. He recognized it for what it was: observation. He spent the evening reviewing public schedules from his quarters, committing them to memory. The child's movements were listed only in general terms now, protected by classification. But one detail stood out. The child was scheduled for supervised instruction off-site. Transport required. He closed the terminal and sat still in the dim light. The room was quiet, walls thick enough to mute the palace beyond. Somewhere, footsteps echoed distantly. Protocol dictated that once ordered to stand down, he should disengage entirely. Preservation of evidence without authorization could be construed as misconduct. Instinct dictated something else. He did not act yet. The following morning, the transport bay was already active when he arrived. Personnel moved efficiently, voices low, routines practiced. The same vehicle sat in position, cleaned, inspected, cleared. Unit 7. The guard took his assigned place near the dispatch terminal, posture neutral, eyes scanning as required. No one acknowledged him directly. They did not need to. The compliance officer arrived shortly after, accompanied by 2 administrative aides. Their presence was justified on paper as instructional oversight. The child followed several steps behind, escorted by palace staff. The guard watched without staring. As before, the child showed no outward distress, clothing neat, movements controlled. But the child's hands remained clenched, fingers tight against the fabric. The compliance officer placed a hand on the child's arm to guide them forward. This time the grip was firmer. The child stiffened. The guard's attention sharpened. He stepped forward half a pace, just enough to enter the interaction space. "Safety check," he said calmly, addressing no one in particular. His voice carried authority without volume. The compliance officer turned, expression unreadable. "We're cleared." "Yes," the guard replied. "Revised transport directive requires confirmation of restraint protocols for minors." That was true. Recently issued, obscure, rarely cited. The compliance officer hesitated. A fraction of a second. Enough. The guard gestured subtly toward the vehicle. "Alternate seating configuration," he added, "reduces transfer risk." The compliance officer released the child's arm. No argument followed. None was needed. Administrative authority rarely challenged security in front of staff. The child stepped forward on their own and entered the vehicle. The door closed. The compliance officer's eyes met the guard's briefly. Not anger, recognition. The transport proceeded without further incident. On paper, nothing had happened. Later that day, the guard was summoned again. This time, the tone was different. "You exceeded instruction," the oversight representative said, seated across from him. "You were told to stand down." "I maintained safety compliance," the guard replied. The senior figure leaned forward slightly. "You are preserving something," he said quietly. "We don't yet know what." The guard did not reply. "You should understand," the man continued, "that once trust is withdrawn, consequences follow." The guard met his gaze steadily. Understood. He was dismissed without formal reprimand. By evening, his reassignment notice arrived. Effective immediately, he was removed from transport oversight and reassigned to a static post with no system access. The cost had been assessed. As he took up his new position that night, standing watch beneath an archway far from internal movement corridors, he considered what remained. The evidence was not in his possession anymore, but it existed, and the child had not been touched again that day. That, for now, would have to be enough. The static post overlooked a service courtyard rarely used after dusk. Stone walls rose on 3 sides, their surfaces darkened by age and weather. A single security light cast a narrow cone across the ground, leaving the corners in shadow. From here, the royal guard could hear the palace rather than see it. Doors closing, distant footsteps, the low murmur of systems cycling through the night. He had been placed where he could observe little and influence nothing. That, at least, was the intention. His access privileges had been stripped to the minimum required for presence.
no terminals, no internal channels beyond emergency response. His weapon remained, his uniform unchanged, but the architecture of authority around him had shifted. Still, movement passed through the courtyard. Not officially, not scheduled, but the palace, like any living structure, required circulation beyond what was published. Shortly after nightfall, he noticed the lights along the upper passage flicker on in sequence. Someone was approaching from the residential wing, moving toward the auxiliary corridor that connected to the service drive. The route was rarely used, chosen mostly for discretion. He straightened slightly. Two figures emerged into view, one adult, one child. The escort was not uniformed, administrative clothing again, the compliance officer. The child walked half a step behind, posture rigid, gaze fixed ahead. Their shoes made little sound on the stone. The guard did not move. From his position, intervention would be conspicuous, unauthorized, likely futile. He watched instead. The compliance officer spoke quietly, leaning down just enough to assert presence. The child nodded once. A hand reached out, resting briefly on the child's shoulder. The touch lingered longer than necessary. The guard keyed his emergency channel, not to call attention, but to log presence. The system registered his alert as a routine status ping, time-stamped, location fixed. He stepped forward into the light. "Evening movement?" he asked, voice calm, tone neutral. The compliance officer turned. Surprise flickered, quickly controlled. "Instructional relocation," the officer replied. "Cleared." The guard nodded. "Transport required?" "No." The child shifted weight from one foot to the other. "Route passes through restricted service space. Protocol requires escort verification." The compliance officer's jaw tightened slightly. "Where authorized." "Then verification will be quick." Silence stretched. The courtyard seemed to contract, sound dampened by stone. The compliance officer removed a tablet and displayed the clearance. The guard glanced at it without touching. The authorization was valid. He did not challenge it. Instead, he adjusted his stance, positioning himself just enough to break the physical line between adult and child. "Proceed," he said. "I'll accompany to the junction." It was not a request. The compliance officer hesitated, then stepped back half a pace. The child moved forward, now walking beside the guard rather than behind the adult. The escort resumed, but the dynamic had changed. They walked in silence. The child's breathing slowed. The guard matched pace precisely, neither leading nor trailing. At the junction, the corridor widened. Surveillance cameras were visible again. "This is sufficient," the compliance officer said. The guard stopped. Confirmed. The child continued forward without being prompted. The compliance officer watched them go, then turned to the guard. "This isn't your assignment," the officer said quietly. "No, it's my responsibility." The compliance officer did not respond. They turned and walked back the way they had come. The guard remained until the child disappeared around the corner. Only then did he return to his post.
The response was delayed but inevitable. The following morning the guard was summoned not to oversight but to executive security. The office was larger, the furnishings understated, the windows clear. From here the palace looked orderly, contained. "You are developing a reputation," the director said, seated behind a broad desk. His voice was even, his expression controlled. "Not for misconduct, for persistence." The guard stood at attention.
You have been removed from transport, from records, from internal review, the director continued, and yet you continue to involve yourself. I respond to what I observe, the guard said. The director studied him for a moment. Observation is not intervention. Not always, the guard replied. A pause. The individual you are concerned about, the director said carefully, operates within delegated authority. Oversight exists. Yes, the guard said, it has not been used. The director exhaled slowly. You are forcing a situation. I am documenting it, the guard corrected. The director leaned back. Documentation becomes accusation once submitted. Yes. Silence settled again, heavier this time. Why? The director asked. The guard did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice remained level. Because the child alters behavior in that presence. The director's gaze sharpened. Explain. The child becomes quieter, movements constrict, compliance increases without instruction. The director nodded slowly. You understand the implications of that assessment? Yes. Another pause. You will submit no further reports through informal channels. If you act again, it will be interpreted as insubordination. The guard accepted the statement without reaction. When he returned to his post, the palace was already adjusting. Movement schedules shifted. Escort compositions changed subtly. The administrative escort appeared less frequently near the residential wing. Nothing official was announced. That afternoon, the child crossed the inner courtyard during a scheduled movement. 2 guards accompanied them, no administrative escort. The child walked normally, not rushed, not restrained. The guard observed from a distance, hands clasped behind his back. Later, alone again beneath the archway, he considered the cost. His career trajectory had narrowed. Advancement was unlikely now. Trust, as defined by the institution, had been compromised. But the system had reacted. Not with justice, not with accountability, with caution. Sometimes that was enough to create space. He remained at his post as evening fell, eyes scanning the courtyard, listening to the palace breathe. The truth had not been spoken aloud, but it was moving now, quietly, through channels that could no longer pretend it did not exist.
The oversight channel existed precisely so no one had to admit it did. It was buried 3 layers deep in the security framework, accessible only through a sequence of authorizations rarely used outside formal audits. Its purpose was narrow, to preserve material that could not be resolved at the operational level without contaminating the process. It did not promise action, only receipt. The Royal Guard accessed it from a terminal he was no longer supposed to use. The opportunity came during a late afternoon security drill, an unscheduled one, announced with just enough notice to justify temporary access reinstatement for all senior guards. The palace shifted into controlled motion. Doors locked and unlocked in sequence. Personnel moved according to pre-assigned roles. He took his place in the monitoring room, one of 6 guards assigned to observe simulated breaches. Screens filled the wall, feeds overlapping, each tagged with status indicators. The hum of equipment settled into a steady background noise. No one watched him closely. Drills created their own blind spots. He did not upload documents. Instead, he submitted a structured disclosure, metadata only, dates, times, file identifiers, access logs, route changes, authority chains.
the existence of suppressed material without attaching the material itself. The system required a statement of relevance. He wrote carefully. Repeated alterations to minor principal movement and transport protocols coinciding with incomplete or suppressed documentation indicate a pattern of discretionary authority exercised without sufficient oversight. Child welfare risk cannot be ruled out. No adjectives, no conclusions. He attached his service identification and submitted the packet. The system acknowledged receipt with a neutral confirmation code. No follow-up instructions appeared. That was expected. He logged out and returned to his assigned screen as if nothing had happened. The drill concluded without incident. Guards dispersed. Access privileges reverted. By evening, the palace returned to its usual rhythm. Lights softened, corridors emptied, the day's disruptions smoothed over by routine. The guard felt no relief. Disclosure was not protection, it was exposure. He stood watch that night beneath the archway, the same static post he had occupied for days now. The stone beneath his boots was cold. The air carried the faint scent of damp earth from the courtyard beyond. Shortly before midnight, his internal channel activated. Report to Executive Security, immediate. He acknowledged and left his post, passing through corridors that seemed quieter than usual. Doors that normally stood open were closed. The palace felt watchful. The executive office was lit when he arrived. 3 figures waited inside. The director, the oversight representative, and a 4th, someone he had not seen before, seated slightly apart, observing rather than participating. "Sit," the director said. He did. "You submitted a disclosure," the director said. It was not a question. "Yes." The oversight representative leaned forward slightly. "You understand the implications of what you've done?" "Yes." The director folded his hands. "This triggers review beyond our control." "Yes." Silence followed, not tense, assessing. "You have effectively removed yourself from internal resolution," the director said. "Whatever follows will not be quiet." The guard met his gaze. It already wasn't. The director studied him for a moment longer, then nodded once. "That will be all." The consequences arrived in increments. The first was administrative. The next morning, his reassignment became permanent. Static perimeter duty. No internal access. No participation in transport, records, or child detail. The notice cited operational necessity and workload balance. It did not mention the disclosure. The second was social. Conversations shortened when he entered rooms. Colleagues remained professional but distant. He was no longer asked for informal input. His name stopped appearing on rotation preference lists. None of it was overt. None of it needed to be. The third consequence came a week later. An external review team arrived at the palace under the guise of routine compliance audit. They wore neutral attire, carried no insignia, and moved with deliberate anonymity. Their presence was not announced to most staff. But procedures changed. Movement approvals now required dual authorization. Escort compositions expanded. Transport logs gained additional verification fields. Incomplete files could no longer be closed without commentary. The compliance officer was still present in the palace, but their role narrowed. They no longer appeared alone with the child, not once. The guard observed all of this from a distance. He did not approach the review team. He was not contacted by them. That too was expected. Oversight protected its sources by never acknowledging them. One afternoon, during a scheduled movement across the inner courtyard, the child passed within sight of his post. 2 guards accompanied them. Their pace was unhurried. No administrative escort followed. The child's posture was different now. Not relaxed exactly, but no longer rigid. Steps fell evenly. Hands were unclenched. As they passed, the child glanced briefly toward the archway. The guard did not react. No nod, no acknowledgement. He remained still, eyes forward, as protocol required. The child continued on. Later that evening, the director passed through the perimeter checkpoint where the guard stood, watch. They exchanged the briefest of nods, nothing more. No thanks were offered, none were needed. The guard remained at his post as the palace lights dimmed, shadows lengthened across stone. Somewhere inside, processes unfolded slowly, deliberately. Reviews took time. Authority resisted change until resistance became inefficient. He would not see the outcome. That was the cost. But the record existed now, outside the palace, beyond any single officer's control. The truth had weight because it had been placed where it could not be quietly removed. The guard adjusted his stance and continued his watch, the archway framing the courtyard beyond. He had done what he could, and for the child that had been enough to alter the path forward, even if no one ever said his name aloud.
The reassignment settled into permanence. Weeks passed without formal notice of conclusion or closure. No findings were announced, no statements circulated. The palace did not acknowledge investigations, it absorbed them. Changes appeared instead as revisions to procedure, subtle and incremental, framed as efficiency rather than correction. The royal guard learned the new rhythms of his post beneath the outer arcade. Morning light filtered through stone arches, casting long shadows across the walkway. In the afternoons, the air warmed and carried the distant sound of activity from the inner grounds. By evening, the space returned to quiet. He stood watch through all of it. His duties were limited now: credential verification, perimeter observation, presence. It was work that required discipline but little judgment. That too was intentional. From here he saw less, but what he saw mattered. The first indication came in the form of an updated directive posted on the internal notice board near shift change. Movement protocols for minor principals had been revised, language tightened, discretion narrowed. Behavioral oversight was now explicitly separated from transport authority. No explanation accompanied the update. The guard read it once and committed it to memory. Days later, he noticed that transport units rotated more frequently. Unit 7 disappeared from service, reassigned to logistics outside the residential loop. No announcement, no reason given. The compliance officer remained employed. Authority rarely disappeared outright, but their presence had shifted. They appeared in meetings, not corridors, in groups, not alone, their influence diluted by process. The guard observed all of this without recording it. One afternoon, rain moved in unexpectedly. The stone darkened, surfaces slick and reflective. From his post, he watched staff adjust routes, umbrellas opening and closing in practiced rhythm. The child crossed the courtyard under escort during the downpour. 2 guards, no administrative presence. The child wore a coat too large, sleeves extending past the wrists. They walked carefully, adjusting steps to avoid puddles, head slightly bowed against the rain. At the edge of the arcade, they paused,
waiting for clearance to proceed. The guard stepped forward just enough to be visible and raised a hand, routine signal. The escort halted. "Proceed," he said, voice level. The child moved past, close enough that he could hear the faint rustle of fabric, the quickened breath from the cold. They did not look up. They did not need to. The guard returned to his position as the group disappeared into the residential wing. He felt no satisfaction, only confirmation.
The palace did not thank him. Institutions rarely did. They adjusted, rebalanced, and moved forward without acknowledging the friction that forced change. Careers advanced or stalled accordingly. Some names faded from rotation lists. Others quietly reappeared in safer contexts. His did neither. He remained where he was, reliable, contained, professionally invisible. On his last rotation of the month, he stood watch as dusk settled, the sky dimming beyond the arches. The palace lights activated in sequence, windows glowing softly against the encroaching dark. A junior guard approached during shift overlap, hesitating briefly before speaking. "They've updated the training modules," the junior said. "Child interaction standards, mandatory review." The guard nodded. "Good." The junior lingered a moment longer, then moved on. Later that night, alone again, the guard reviewed his own service record through the limited interface still available to him. No commendations had been added, no reprimands either. His file was clean in the way that suggested deliberate neutrality. At the bottom of the record, beneath closed cases and resolved notes, a new entry appeared. External disclosure. Acknowledged. No details, no outcome, just existence. He closed the file. That was enough. As he resumed his watch, he listened to the palace settle into night, systems cycling, distant doors closing, the faint echo of footsteps fading into stillness. Somewhere inside, a child slept under procedures now less flexible, less personal, more accountable. Protection rarely looked like intervention. More often, it looked like absence of opportunity, of access, of unchecked authority. The guard remained still, eyes scanning the courtyard one final time before the hour changed. He had not been promoted, he had not been vindicated, but the record remained, and as long as it did, what had happened could not be fully erased.